So to make it easy, let's start with when you were born in Tampa, right?
I was born in Tampa, Florida, yes.
1923.
1923 on Halloween Eve, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And the street in front of where we were renting was it was dirt street, level. There was no curb, just dirt going off into crabgrass. There were trees on each side of the street, Burn Street.
And you lived there until?
Probably 2 or 3 years. The street ran right off into some reeds that were on the estuary in Tampa Bay. It was on the very, compared to today, it was very early Tampa.
Mm.
And my memories there are several little events that I remember. I could try to make them chronological. I've tried to recall when I was actually a baby in a baby crib, and I remember hearing this old alarm clock that had 3 legs. I've checked to see since that time, and I believe it was the kind that had the bell on top, and it made a lot of noise. When it ran, it went tick-tock, tick-tock, tick. But in my childish mind, I remember the rhythm of it, and it would become syncopated. There we go. Tickety-tock, tickety-tockety, tickety-tockety, and then it would get out of phase, and then it would get back into phase and go tick-tock, tick-tock, then it would go tick-tick-tock-tock, tick-tick-tock-tock, and then it'd get back. So I remember listening to that. So auditorily, I think those are my first memories.
Do you remember, your dad was a doctor, right?
My father at that time was my real father, and he owned a half interest in a paper company called Peninsula Paper Company. But being anxious for the company to succeed, he would go on the road a lot to sell the paper. And the kind of paper products he sold were like paper bags for grocery stores, or the rolls of paper that you would use to wrap things. And he had an old Essex that was bought by the company. I think it was $200 to buy a car like that.
How old was he when you were born, do you know?
He must have been in his early 40s, about your age, I think. I could figure it out, but that's about it.
Do you have a lot of memories of him? I mean, doing things with him, or going around town? Or?
I remember him taking me on his shoulders to get vanilla ice cream in a little cup with a little wooden spoon. Why I would remember these things, I don't know, but I did. And then I have thought about it since, so it's reinforced my memory so that I don't lose that memory. He walked down the street, turned the corner, and walked another 2 or 3 blocks to a little ice cream parlor, and he'd buy the cup, and that was a real treat. If you're a child that's never been exposed to anything but mother's milk, why, it was exciting.
He was in Florida because of the job, the paper company? I mean, he was from North Carolina originally, right?
Yes. To go back to his life, he was from Old Salem, down where the square is. He'd been born in what was called the Brothers' House, and my mother had several suitors. One of them ultimately became well known as a bank president, but I think my father was better looking, and evidently she loved him, or was infatuated with him more than any of the other Salem boys. And
the Brothers' House was where all the midwives were working for the delivery, is that right? In Old Salem?
In Old Salem, there was a Dr. Severs who was supervised my father's birth.
I remember his house there in the cemetery edge.
Oh, yeah, that was the doctor's house, Dr. Severs' house. ultimately became the residence for the bishop of the old church. The brother's house still is there, and it's around on the outside, one corner of the square.
Mm.
The square is about a block and a half, and in the center of that square was a bandstand, like a gazebo, white, and every weekend the Moravian band would play there. And as a child visiting there, I actually went down, you'd pull daisies, and maybe make a daisy chain, and listen to the music. But my father, when he married my mother, he went to the doctor, Dr. Phole, P-H-O-L-E, I think, who lived next door there at 335 South Main Street, and he was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and I don't think I've ever met anyone that was slower than he was. He was evidently would do a lot of thinking about a case before he'd speak. And he told my father that, this has been told me by my mother after the fact, told the family that he would not have a long life, that he had Bright's disease, which was a disease of the kidney acquired by having had a streptococcal infection. I later learned in med school, strep viridans usually, that affects the immune system, so that you get an immune reaction within the kidney that destroys kidney function. And at this time and at this level of knowledge, he was told, if you expect to live longer than just in your 30s, or you'll have to move to a different climate. So that's why he and my mother moved to Florida.
And you were actually born in Florida.
And that explains why I happened to be born in Florida. Now, when they got to Florida, they knew no one except this Dr. Eford and his wife, because Dr. Eford's wife was the sister to my father.
Mm-hmm.
She was a Rice.
And they also had a brother, Douglas, is that correct?
My father had a brother, Douglas Rice, yes.
Okay.
So to get back to Fern Street, or where I was born at home, in an upstairs bedroom, my mother was delivered by this Dr. Eford, who was the husband of my father's sister. And I don't think he charged anything. It was like someone in the family. And my father, although he had been in line and knew accounting, he had been in line to be an accountant for Reynolds Tobacco Company. But my mother's sister married Charles Griffith, whom I later lived with, and he was the one that became the accountant for Reynolds Tobacco Company. So my father joined forces with a Mr. Clark, and they owned this Peninsula Paper Company. My mother was often, a week at a time left there at home, or it was upstairs apartment. And so she was the one that watched over me. And as far as events in my life at that time, when Easter time came, I was told that Easter Monday would come, and I would wake up in the morning and look out the window. I couldn't get out of the window because there was a screen there, but I could strain my eyes to look down and see this nest that was made out of Spanish moss, and they would put dyed Easter eggs, or chicken eggs,
yeah,
and very colorful, and that was all exciting. The
How old are you here when you have
about
those memories?
3. And I remember my father played a violin as well as he played a cornet in the Moravian band and was considered quite a good cornet player. And my mother played the piano. She wasn't too well trained in that, but they would play a duet, and I have trouble finding the music that they used to play, but I used to, in the evening when I'd go to sleep, I'd turn the piano stool upside down, so it was like a little 4-poster bed, and I would get inside that and like to just listen to sounds, talk conversation. Didn't want to be off somewhere in a room. I'd rather be with people and listen to them.
This was in the time of radio too. Did you guys listen?
There was no radio.
No radio?
No radio. Before radio. I was there in Tampa when radios came into being, and they squeaked and squawked. They were AM, and they had no, heterodyne was something that came a little later. But you really worked hard to get onto a station.
How old were you when you got this train?
Oh, that was when I was about between 6 and 7. And
It's kind of neat.
it was a pretty good replica, and being a Lionel, and of course they were anxious to give me a present, and they really went out on a limb to buy an expensive gift for this for me. And I don't know why it is, but children so often remember something that goes wrong rather than things that go right. It was so nice to get this, but they, instead of getting a big expensive transformer, they got one that worked on a very small circular track, but it was not enough real power for this. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. But this had little flags that were up here, and
What was their reaction?
light that
Do you
goes-
remember them?
What's that?
What was their reaction? Do you remember? When it
No.
wasn't enough?
No, I wasn't observant of their
Oh.
reaction. I wasn't even really thinking about them. I think, like so many children, you think about yourself.
Yeah.
I didn't, I was very courteous. I didn't say, why doesn't it work or anything like that. I was always nice.
Yeah.
I was not a difficult child.
No. Do you remember?
Well, Scott, I know that I ramble, but I'm really kind of just emptying out the memories I have.
No, it's good. Actually, what I'm interested to hear, and it's good to do it chronologically because it makes more sense. But I mean, so that if you remember that when your father was 6, how old were you when your father passed away?
Yeah. Let me touch on 2 things because I think it was formative for later years. Still on Burn Street, where I first lived. Storms, of course, are very common in Florida. Hurricanes and all. And so in my innocence, the windows were rattling and the storm was blowing outside. I went to the window. I think they probably had it closed for rain or something, but I opened it and I was trying to quote what Jesus had said when he was with the fishermen out on this lake, and they thought they were going to drown or die or going. He just stood up and said, "Peace, be still," and the storm went away. Well, in my innocence as a child, I stood in that window and I said, "Peace, be still," as though I had some control over the weather. And many times I think I did things like this in my family, would indulge it and wouldn't say, oh, don't be silly, or get away from the window. They would let me go through these things, and they might kind of smile behind my back. Another time I remember learning a lesson was when I was with some young boys about my same age, except a little bit older. There were some little kittens that had been born, and they decided they would bury the kittens, so they loose Florida sand, they dug a hole which is almost like a doodlebug hole, if you know what a doodlebug is. It's has an angle of repose so that when anything gets in there, the sand starts sliding down. The doodlebug knows that something's in his land. It's kind of like as you know, it's kind of like a spider web, but he knows something's up there because the sand's falling down. So he comes up and eats whatever it is. Well, anyway, they dug a grave about the slant of a doodlebug hole, but it was big enough to put these kittens in and throw the sand over them. But it was sand that was loosely associated, so there was a little air pocket kind of in there. But I didn't stop them, and I didn't actually throw any dirt on the kittens, but I went inside that evening at the dinner table. I sat very morosely, didn't say anything, but my parents were observant, and they started looking at me and saying, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And finally I whispered, "We buried the cats." And they said, "What? You buried the cats?" As though it was a big catastrophe. I said, "Yeah, we buried the cats." So, "Where?" "In the back." So, "Where? Let's see." So they took me downstairs. We were living upstairs. Took downstairs, and we went out in the backyard and said, "Where?" So I showed them the place and this loose sand, and they dug it up, and the kittens were all full of sand, but they were not dead. So they were wobbling around. I don't know how much of their brain power was left, but I think, I'm guessing now that they probably could recover.
Yeah.
So anyway, to enforce how bad that was, my mother took her hand and put it over my nose and mouth, and I couldn't breathe. Just okay. I wasn't fighting or kicking or anything. I was just suffering. And she said, "Now that's the way those little kittens are when you do that to them." So that was a lesson about that. Another lesson I'm going to mention before we go on to the rest of my life is I was looking out the window one day when this seagull, because we were near the water there, seagull was obviously sick, and so I went out and I was able to put it inside of a triangular, looked like something you'd put a chicken in, and I went upstairs and I looked out in horror, and there was a cat that had gotten into this cage and gotten the seagull, and I saw this wing dragging behind the cat as the cat walked away with the seagull. And just the, to me, the cruel nature of the way nature works began at that point, that life is more and more, as I learned in maturity, life is a battle going on all the time, everywhere, whether it's in the trees or in the sand or in living animals. So anyway, then for some reason I think it was undoubtedly economics, because we're talking about from 1923 to 27, we're talking about the approaching hard times, the recession,
Great
Depression.
Yeah.
So we moved out to Palmacia. And
Where were you sailing? Was that in Tampa, or was that when you moved to?
Where was I what?
Sailing as a child? I remember you mentioned
sailed a lot.
that you had done.
That was more after I had been to North Carolina and came back down. I was real young, didn't do any sailing.
So you moved to Palmacia. How old were you when?
About, I started school in Palmacia.
Where is that?
Palmacia is pretty close to Tampa Bay, and it's a division of Tampa that's is what you'd call it the better part of town. It's not towards Ybor City or the Spanish part of town. It was towards the west.
Was that for work that your father moved?
That was just for our domicile where we lived.
Okay.
His place of business was pretty much downtown. Big warehouse. And,
Do you remember the school you went to there?
oh, do I remember that school? Yes, I've been to it several times since. It was Hoover, Roosevelt High School, and it was torture. When I was told I was going to school, I first thought it was going to be great, and I got a big yellow pad and a pencil with an eraser and getting prepared for school. But going to school, I was away from home, and I suppose you'd say, mother's boy, and I was put in the hard. They arranged this so that the taller people were at the back of the class. So I was taller, and so I was at the back of the class. And later learned I was nearsighted, but I couldn't see what was going on, and my thoughts were elsewhere. And the teacher was a rough teacher that used to shake children. If they didn't answer correctly, she'd take them by both shoulders and shake them. I can remember. And it scared me. I was just frightened, and I hated school. And my family had arranged for people to take turns picking up the children, so in the morning when I was waiting, it was like waiting to hear the carriage to take you to a guillotine. And the car would stop in front of my house, and I'd say, well, I had to go. But to help me go, my parents, usually my mother, because my father was traveling, would get me a little gift of some kind, like a little Zeppelin, because the Zeppelin was coming into being at that time. And so that I would look forward to that reward if I could stay in school. So a few times she went to watch the teacher, and always when she was there, the teacher was better behaved, didn't shake the children.
Is this the school where you had that, what was it, you
Yes.
told me some story with the other child?
Yes, that was the school.
What was the
This
story?
was the second grade. Between the first, it was the second grade by then.
They were telling you a story?
Yeah, a man came to speak to children at in the auditorium about being kind to animals and the birds. And he told a story about a mama bird and a baby bird, and I immediately think in terms of human beings. And the mother bird goes out to get food for the little baby birds, and then some kids come along and throw a rock and kill the mama bird. And so all these little baby birds are left there in the nest with no food, and no one comes to feed them, and they may die. And he made it sound so horrible that I began to cry. But crying like that wasn't considered manly. Little boys never cry,
Right.
So when the teacher looked over and I was bawling, she said, "What's the matter?" Wondering, what's going on? And I said, "Oh, this guy kicked me," but and he was innocent. And so the truth eventually came out. But it's interesting how you want to protect.
Oh, and what's funny is the two stories I remember you have conveyed to me from years ago, the train and this, and it's, whenever you tell these things, it's I was interrupted. People always come in. So you were how old when you left that school?
Well, my father was beginning to get sick about then, but we moved, and
Where did you move to? That's when you were closer to family in North Carolina?
No, this time, you see, I called him Uncle Doc, but this is the doctor that delivered me, and for free, I'm sure, who was married to my father's sister. He had an apartment, and The apartment was, he had an apartment building, and there were 4 units in it, 2 up above and 2 down below. He had his mother in one of the upper apartments, and he allowed my mother and father to live in the other apartment. His office was down on the first floor. He had his own pharmacy, and he had what you might call a biracial waiting room. He had a little tiny room about 12 by 12 for black people, and he had a room that was more like a living room that might have been 17 by 12 or something for the white people. And I think he charged $2 an office visit. He had chairs all around each of these little rooms, and they would come in and wait their turn, no appointments. And my mother and my sick father lived upstairs, and I had transferred from that grammar school to Garvey. I'd been at Roosevelt, now I went to Garvey. I couldn't read, having trouble with school, and we were moving, and my father was sick, and my mother treated him. He had high blood pressure and was developing congestive heart failure. So
How old were you at this point that you moved?
I was about 8, I think, when we moved there, about between 7 and 8, and then at age 9, is when my father died on my birthday, as a matter of fact, and he had developed swelling of his ankles, and obviously he couldn't be working, and he was going to go to the bathroom, and he got in the bathroom, and he called my mother Patsy as a nickname, and he said, "Patsy, the lights are going out." And then I heard ka-flump as he fell to the floor. He'd lost consciousness. Went in there. My mother did. I didn't go in the bathroom. And he had died. So it just really was inconceivable to me that that life could be like that. I just, at that age, it's a funny, not funny, strange, peculiar thing.
What did you do? You ran out of there, right?
Well, what happened, they asked me to go over to, see, I was in that upper apartment, to go over to his mother, that is the Dr. Eford's mother, apartment. And she was, these 2 apartments were side by side, and they consisted of, you know, a living room, a kitchen, and a dining room, and a little back porch. So I went over to her place, and they obviously saw I was grieving, and so she looks up on this little bric-a-brac thing hanging on the wall, and there was a little silver elephant up there, and she very thoughtfully said, "Here's a present for you." And so it's interesting how something can distract you a little bit. So I took the elephant, and I was appreciative. I thanked her. And of course, I don't know what you do with a little silver elephant, but it was her gesture, I think, that made me show that somebody really cared about what happened.
Hmm.
So that's what I remember about that night.
And how old were you? You moved in when you were 8, but your father
died when I was 9, yeah.
9, okay.
So we hadn't been there more than a year. But the thing that's I'm not saying that was going on at this time, my father's sister, the doctor's wife, my father's sister thought that my mother was killing my father. She felt that, I don't understand why, because there was absolutely no reason for my mother to kill my father. He didn't have much insurance, and she very much loved him, and there was absolutely no motive. And I to this day, it was a psychological thing on Dr. Everett's wife. But
me turn the printer off on this. Okay.
Well, at the time of his illness, and your heart muscle is giving out because of the increased blood pressure and so forth, due to the kidney disease, it was common practice for doctors to give people digitalis, and they gave it as an injection. So my mother had to learn how to boil a needle, fix a syringe. I had watched her do this, and draw up the ampule of digitalis and give it to my father. So I think Auntie, as I call her, the doctor's wife, knew that she was giving injections, but she thought that my mother was killing my father.
Hmm.
So anyway, that was that chapter in my life, and
Do you remember was he buried in North Carolina then?
yes,
So you guys
this was the day of the train, not airplane.
Mm-hmm.
So I know the train station quite well, and I can remember the voices echoing as you went into the waiting room.
Hmm.
And around the newsstand would be little lanterns with candy in them and things, newspapers and candy, and the famous pronouncement like, all aboard, like in that movie we saw, Einsteigen in the German, but I got into a step, and had a little stool you step on to get up into the train, and I saw them rolling the casket with my father in it into the baggage part, and you can't help but feel a lot like a human. So we were headed for Winston-Salem, and that was, I remember all of the events there, and going to the graveyard, and enduring the lowering of the casket and listening to the horns play those mournful hymns that the Moravians probably had played for centuries.
Yeah. You'd been to North Carolina a few times as a child.
At Christmas time, usually we'd go up there if we went, and I think we only went maybe twice, but it was quite an event. First time event, we went up there, and again, a sermon was made out of this by some preacher because they told me we were going to North Carolina, and I'd seen Christmas cards with snow and Santa Claus, and so in Florida there's no snow, there's no Santa Claus. So I got ready to go, and I had some World War I puttees that you lace on, and I put on 2 pairs of pants, and I had a wool sweater, and sweat was rolling.
Thinking you're headed to the snow country.
Yeah. I wanted to be prepared, and of course, some parents would have said, "Oh, you crazy thing," or no, don't put that on," or try to boss me. But they didn't try to boss me at all. They just kind of snickered or talked about it maybe behind my back.
Right.
So we got in this old Essex which had a cloth top and wooden spokes on the wheels, and started for North Carolina, and it was a long way in those days, and all the highways some of them in Florida were made out of bricks, and there were only 2 lanes, one going one way and one going another, and the cows were allowed to sleep on the highway, so it was a totally different picture than today.
Yeah.
And that was interesting to look back on. But by the time it got to Jacksonville, not only was it cold, but it began to snow, and the family looked at me, and I was totally unconcerned, except that it was interesting to see, because I knew it was coming. I had prayed for it.
Yeah. What was the destination? Where were you guys going to stay?
Well, we go to Savannah, and then Waycross, Georgia. I remember the name. Was another. Those were.
But I mean, to stay with your uncle?
Railroad
or
station.
For
We were going to
Christmas?
stay with Grandma, who was in 335 South Main Street, down in Salem. That's where we were headed.
And that was that other house that also borders the cemetery. Is that right?
It was on the avenue by the cemetery.
Mm.
And so we got into snow and slush, and ice covered the windshield. And in seeing that movie recently, Seabiscuit, I saw with that car that crashed, they used to have the windshield so you could push the windshield out.
Right.
And the windows iced up, and you'd roll the window down, and there's still a sheet of ice there. And we had a hell of a time getting through that slush with no chains. And but we eventually, it was one of the really tough winters.
Mm.
And
when you say grandmother, we're headed to, this is your mother's
mother,
Ormsby.
yeah, the Ormsby house.
Uh-huh.
My grandfather had died long ago, but grandmother was still there.
And how about your father's parents?
You know, they were both dead. As you've learned from Graham, most of the Wrights died pretty early. On the right side, the most that I remember was my father's brother, Douglas, who seemed to love to write and study, and he had 3 boys. They were all just children, of course, when I was there. How he ever was able to write a book, I don't know, but I have that book there on the American Indians that he wrote, that he would sequester himself in his study and do his research. He used to like to travel around to the different Cherokee Indian reservations and talk to the chiefs and things. He's very much into the American Indian scene. But on my mother's side, my grandmother was quite elderly, and she developed pneumonia one time. I can remember sitting in the room with her. There was no treatment, of course, no penicillin, no antibiotics. Fresh air was treatment. So they opened all the windows, and these curtains would be blowing, and it would be kind of chilly.
Mm.
And she'd be in this high bed, in a 4-poster bed with the wind blowing, and if they were fortunate, they could live through the 4 stages of lobar pneumonia and come out of it get well. And
Yeah.
she did that at least twice that I know of.
And then you made a move to Winston-Salem.
All of this, was before I made the actual move. My mother at this point had no job, had lost her husband, so she consulted.
And we're right in the Depression now, right?
Yeah, consulted her sister, Elizabeth, who was teaching home economics at Salem College, about what could she do, get a job. She was not trained for anything, she was not. But her sister had a daughter that was in New York at the Brooklyn Home for Children, and she was the dietitian there, and she got a job for my mother as a caretaker for children around age 6 or 7, which was about the age I was when my father died at 9. So when she moved to New York, she left me with her sister, Elizabeth, Griffith, the Griffith household, Charles Griffith.
And he was the accountant at R.J. Reynolds.
Accountant at R.J. Reynolds. They were very loyal to the people, although he had never had much formal training in what you might call modern accounting. He was the accountant for R.J. Reynolds.
And this was the house that was near the country club there?
Yeah, that was out in called West View.
And Bob Ormsby lived in that area also?
No, he lived downtown.
Oh, that's right.
Near Salem on Brantley Street.
Okay.
And
who was it? I seem to remember you had a story of having an intercom line drawn between 2 houses.
Yeah. Yep. We had a lot of freedom. The aunt with whom I was staying, she had her things garden club, our lady friends. I had friends, boys around the neighborhood my age, and we went through sandlot football, baseball, and tinkering with inventions. We strung a line between two houses and had a little carriage you could pull between them to send messages back and forth, and it was true freedom. I had a little BB gun, and we shot an awful lot of sparrows. Sparrows were fair game. No one liked English sparrows. They infested the ivy that grew on the walls, and there were plenty of them. And you never shot a mockingbird. As you know, in the movie, they never kill a mockingbird. Expressed the feeling all children had then: you just don't shoot a mockingbird. Presumably because they make pretty sounds. But anything else, we'd shoot blue jays. Blue jays were bad because they broke eggs and ate other birds' eggs. So we spent a lot of time hunting around in the bushes, and we could watch for a little movement. And you get, little children's eyes are pretty sharp, and every time you would kill a bird, you'd make a notch in the handle stock of your gun, and so you'd kind of pride yourself on how many notches you had on your gun. And I think this was not frowned upon by adults, because so many adults in those days were from the country, and in the South all households had guns, and they usually had it over the fireplace for, if it's not Indians, or it could be for wild animals, but it was just part of the culture.
Mm-hmm. And you got along pretty well with your aunt and your uncle? They were both...
Yeah, my uncle worked hard, and he came home usually around 5 o'clock, and he'd sit out and read the paper and smoke. And that was, of course, killing him when he smoked. And he was somewhat of a hypochondriac. Ever since he had to have appendectomy, he took his pulse a lot, sat around, and I used to sit with him, and he, at one point, he never took me hunting, except just in the neighborhood. We'd go out in a vacant field with his 16-gauge shotgun, and I shot a couple of quail. But the neighbors, he'd tell me about these things. So-and-so took his grandson out to shoot skeet or trap or go hunting, but he never took me for that sort of thing. I think it was maybe because of expense. But he did love to take me fishing, which was a great event. So I was very fortunate to have a caring uncle and aunt that helped me grow up at the age 9 through 12. And we'd go fishing up in Lake Haines, and went to Boy Scout camp.
And this was different than, it wasn't like you could just pick up the telephone and call your mom all the time like you can now.
No. But I did miss her, of course, and she sent me some clothes at one point. But somehow the clothes didn't cut it with that age. But my aunt and uncle bought me a sled, and it was snowing, and we went down to the hardware store, or the sporting goods store, Pocock Stroud's the name of it, and bought this flexible flyer, and they hooked it on the back of their Packard. They always had a nice car, and we pulled it home to Westview, and I was in the back seat looking out at it to be sure when they stopped that the sled didn't slide underneath the car or something. But that was a big...
Do you think they enjoyed having you because they didn't have any kids of their own? Or?
I'm certain of it. I'm certain of that. And at one point they did take me on a trip to fish on the coast of North Carolina, Madam Mesquite. But that was the last trip because my uncle couldn't stand the directions from my aunt. She would say, "I told you," and she'd repeat it over and over again, to turn here or turn there, and he would just sit quietly and listen to it, but he got so tired of her. Well, there was just a battle, so he was never going to travel with her again. But I did enjoy that. I did get badly sunburned and mosquitoes. But it was a paradise for wildlife. You could see deer, you could see, and the fish were so plentiful. Every time your line hit the water, you caught a fish. It was just unbelievable.
Was that country club? That country club was already there near their home. Is that right?
The country club was near their home.
Did they use that, the pool, or the? I mean, was that?
I used to go up there in the summertime. It was empty during the wintertime, but during the summertime,
yeah,
I'd swim in that. Yes.
And
in the wintertime, if the snow was on the ground, we could slide down some of those fairways on the golf course.
do you remember leaving your aunt and uncle then? I mean, when your mother came back?
My mother came back, and it seems that she had been visited by my Uncle Doc, who had delivered me, and he influenced her to come back. He was still practicing in Florida, so he influenced her to come and work in his office as a receptionist. And out of that grew a proposal. His marriage to Auntie had been pretty stormy because she was of that period where sexual activity was something just to have children, and that was it. And so their marriage had been pretty rocky for a long time. And the actual fact is he had become an alcoholic, and he sniffed some nose medicines constantly, which was, I think now, cocaine. But no one ever even mentioned the word cocaine, and it wasn't even talked about as a problem.
Right.
But he was propped up by these things, and his father had been a Lutheran minister, and his mother had been, of course, the wife of a Lutheran minister. And people often with that mindset, somehow life isn't like the good book says, and they try to escape, I guess.
Did he influence, I mean, do you remember the medical practice? Did that influence your interest in medicine?
Oh, yes.
I remember you had that big ground glass syringe from your office that
Yeah.
you said was his syringe.
Yes. He had, they call something Wernicke, glass-covered bookcases full of books. In Keene's surgery, each book weighed a ton. I mean, they were huge, and every book was full of all of the kind of wounds of World War I that they tried to repair, and there were plenty. And he had been a doctor in Europe during World War I when that flu hit and killed so many people. He came back a colonel. He belonged to the American Legion, Foreign Wars, and he looked pretty good in his uniform. And he was a success in Tampa at one time, just before the big crash of '29. He owned a whole building, a Stovall building. But since he drank a lot, he really didn't know business. And men could come in his office with a little bottle of oil and say, if you'll invest in this, we're going to make oil will make you a lot of money. And so when my wife saw what was happening, she pretty quickly would get rid of these people and helped him save their house. They would have lost it. So anyway, ultimately, my doctor uncle, Eford, had to divorce his wife, and that created a huge furor with Douglas Wrights, who was the other brother of this woman. And he tried to intervene and stop the divorce. But my mother, I think wisely sat me down and we discussed it. Should she do this or not? And she expressed that at that time, if you got a divorce or married a divorced man and got accused of breaking up a marriage, that was bad news. And she pretty much knew what she was doing. She said, you know, for her it would be very difficult. But I said, no, it's do what you feel best. And so she allowed Dr. Eford to get a divorce and then marry her. So I moved from just living in an apartment to moving into this very spacious house on Davis Island. And that's when I got involved with the water, had sailboat, motorboat, lived in the water many times. Coming off from school, I'd go in the water.
Did you have a sailboat?
Yeah, I had a very nice, it's a National Wind Design. I have a picture of it. It was built actually for us by this young man who knew how to build boats. And it's a pretty boat. It wasn't as fast as it looked. And I named it the Jitterbug. And so this other man about my age who was, I say man, who were like 16, he had a scow, but he had huge sail area. I mean, it was loaded with sail, and mine had a rather short mainsail, and it was not fast. So he would kid me and say, you have a jitterbug, but it won't jit. But he got his testicles caught on his cleat in his boat, and it ripped it open, and he remembers that for sure. But I just lived on the water. I love the water.
Let me just see what's going on with this guy.
This period when I moved back to Tampa,
yeah,
I was entering the 7th grade.
Okay.
And so life began to change from the last time I'd lived in Tampa. This new time is when I moved into a house on Davis Island, had those boats I talked about, and went to Woodrow Wilson Junior High from the 7th grade through the 9th grade. And I was no student. I took Latin but never studied it, and I took, so I didn't get a language at that point.
Mm.
And but I do notice I have a newspaper clipping. I was on a volleyball team that won the city championships.
Mm.
I guess I was a little taller than some. And I was very much into making models and airplanes, mostly.
Yeah.
And also...
and you liked the airplanes. Do I remember correctly that you'd see a lot of the airplanes flying over Florida? And
oh, yes. And
the build
booked a ride on a J3 Cub with a man who flew it around and let me. And then I saw a lot of the pre-World War II planes come through there, and of course with MacDill Field, a little later when they were preparing for World War II, there were a lot of bombers flying over.
And that's when you saw the formations flying over.
Of 1,000 planes. You cannot imagine. I've never seen anything like it since, and I only saw it once. But when they form up and you see the sky filled with 1,000 planes,
yeah,
you know
B-17s or what?
Yeah,
Hmm.
you know that there's most of them. It could have been B-24s too. I'm not sure. It's a lot of power.
As a kid, are you cognizant of the build-up to a war? I mean, it's...
Well, I saw some pursuit planes. I don't know the name of this one. They call them pea shooters, but it's a single-seater, very short little thing. it's a piece something I pursued. Anyway, I saw some of those.
But I mean, you weren't cognizant of the politics of like, do we enter a war? There's a war in
No,
Europe.
that wasn't part of what I read or studied. However, being in the water a lot, I did see Japanese ships filled up with scrap irons that I realized later were being used to blast us.
Yeah.
And one of the men about my father's age, would have been my father's age, my father was dead, but this gentleman was going to make boats. And I think he was making Liberty ships, but Tampa was used to make some boats too. And that, of course, all of that is after the Big Depression. That's when our country really began to produce. So for me, junior high academically was practically nothing, but I aimed to learn and go the route of college preparation. So when I went to high school, I took all math classes. I took algebra 1 and 2, trigonometry, solid geometry, and I had learned to play the trumpet, took lessons. My mother paid for me to have like a half an hour lesson in the evening, afternoon, and I paraded in the parade playing the trumpet. But that was just the very first year of high school. I very quickly tried out for football and was accepted, and that's when I was recognized by other students. And of all things, my nickname was Punchy, because the first time I played, I recall, in Clearwater, Florida, and all these games are played at night. Some guy had gotten injured, and they took him out, and the coach was very dictatorial, very commanding, and everybody, these little kids, when I say little, at the time, we thought we were grown men, but 16, he said, "Right, go in there." And so I jump up like I was struck with a lightning or something. And I went in there, and the next play was right over where I was, and undoubtedly my head was kicked or bucked, and I didn't know where I was for a while. And I don't think people check their pupils for irregularities or concussions, but I think I had a concussion. But it couldn't have lasted 4 years. But I became known as Punchy, and it was kind of a term of endearment because I was a pretty benign, innocuous person. Not very aggressive except on the field. On the field, I would kill anybody that was supposed to be killed. And we had an ROTC, and I was a lieutenant in that. And all of this was just before, this is like in high school was 1940, 41. And of course Germany had already crossed into Poland in 39, so the European war was already going. I became interested in radio and built a little transceiver. It was a transmitter, plus I have a separate unit that was a helicraft receiver.
How old were you when you got your amateur radio license? Do you remember that?
Well, I would have to have been about 16, because I graduated from high school at 17.
Did you know somebody that was an amateur radio operator, or what was
Only after I got interested and built one, because there were clubs and I had...
Was it via a magazine or something that you thought, let me build a radio, or...
See how I got started. I think some people had a crystal set where you could tune in and listen to radio. But the romance of being able to talk over the air to somebody at great distance appealed to me. So I bought books on it, studied books, but had no coaching, no course in it, just curiosity about it. And then you go to the store where they have things to buy, and following the handbook, I just did what they said in the handbook and built this little tiny, that we talked about before, a transmitter that had an L6L. They had a mercury vapor power tube, vacuum tube. This is way, way before transistors. And it was so exciting to see that mercury vapor light up every time you sent a dot or a dash. You saw this thing light up like a lightning bug. And I was infatuated with the visual aspects of that. Plus, then suddenly somebody over there calling your call. It was just such a thrill.
And you were W4HTL?
Yeah. I had a broken mast from my sailboat I put on the roof, and a pulley, and I had what they called a zip antenna that went out to this pine tree and to a weight. And I talked to somebody in California, like it was next door.
And you did not have the ability to do AM
No
or
AM.
sideband?
No, just dot.
Just codes.
Yeah.
But you had a receiver that would receive
Yeah,
AM. You
would
could hear
receive
AM.
that. Yeah. Yeah. And
Is it fair to say in those teenage years, later teenage years, your hobbies were the building models and sailing and ham radio, or?
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I had a lot of curiosity about those things. And
And you actually remember when the hams went off the air, when the war, they started?
I heard it, yes. I was on the air at the time when said we interrupt this broadcast with for the President of the United States. And in his broad Harvard accent, we have been attacked, dastardly attacked by the Japanese. This day, a day that will live in infamy. They have bombed Pearl Harbor. And at that time they said all ham operators should cease and desist using their equipment. So that's when I left the air. But I got a letter, because they have your name on your license and all. Would you like to pursue a new exciting career in something called radar? If you accept this offer, we can give you the rank of petty officer, first class. And I, at that time, was still in high school. My father, who was the doctor, we didn't sit down and talk a whole lot about life and things. He was very busy every day, and so my coach was kind of like my father. I went to my coach, what should I do about the service? And he said, well, you should stay in school as long as you can. He says, if they need you, they'll get you. So instead of jumping into one of the services, like you hear so many people say, I wanted to serve my country, I just listened to what my coach said. And so at that point, senior year, you have to think about college.
Right.
And my application that I sent out to Emory University.
Mm.
All of Florida, there was not a single medical school.
No kidding.
Zero. They had anti-dissection laws and things. So the next state up was Georgia, and Emory was a reputable school. So I applied there, and I got this letter. You have been accepted to Emory University, and at pre-med. And then I had to vow that I'd learn the language.
Mm.
So I took 2 years German and studied my tail off, because I'd have to study something twice as long as other people to really grasp it, being punchy.
And you were at Emory at the same time Bob Ormsby was at Georgia Tech. Is that right?
Yes.
And did you formed a friendship when you were in North Carolina, when you'd gone back to live with your...
Yes. The first time I'd ever been shot at was when I was at his home in North Carolina.
How did you end up, because he lived across town?
Yes.
You were...
He would come over, or I would stay over at his house. Most of the time he was suffering asthma. He'd be in bed wheezing and breathing Asthmador or something, and so I didn't see him every day or anything like that, but yeah, I saw him. Most of my friends were in Westview. Alec O'Brien, some guy named Poodley Cash. Poodley Cash, he was, yeah, those were really different times.